Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Price Formation Enhancement Working Group session number 8. On behalf of the Stakeholder Affairs Group, I welcome you, and my name is Brenda Crone. I'll go ahead and kick things off for our group today. Next slide. For the housekeeping slides here, this call is being recorded for informational and conveniences purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. As we continue these collaborative working groups, we are open to dialogue and engage different perspectives. As well, reminder for those folks on the call that any questions or comments, please make sure to not reiterate, but also make sure they're quick and respectful. Also, we're doing ongoing verbal and written comments during the working group session, so we will be going on that on the next steps on the very end of this working group session. And if you do have any questions for myself or my event producer, Yolanda, will let us know and we will help you. And then also, not on this slide, but we thank everyone for ongoing pre-registering for our stakeholder meetings. For this stakeholder call, we will be sending out that attendance sheet about 10 minutes out. That registration attendance list will show everyone that's on the call, as well as the organization. That's all the information we're providing, but it's just to help out, and because of the new WebEx feature does not allow us to see who's on the call. And then we can go to the next slide, Yolanda. As a reminder, raise hand icon is located on the lower toolbar. Here you'll hear a beep sound when you're unmuted. Make sure you fully ask your question and don't mute yourself if you're asking a question that may require follow-up. So we will make sure to have you unmuted. And at the time of those who are just joining us audio only, just press #2. And I will check with Yolanda to make sure if there's anyone who's listed on the audio only line to ask a question. And then I think that's all I have for now. But today I'll be making sure to capture any questions or comments. But other than that, we do have a few folks on the call. They'll be presented on the next slide on the agenda, if you can. Yeah. So today's agenda, we are going to go ahead and kick things off with Juan for today's goals and next sessions that we have planned for the end of the year, and then hopefully for next year. And then we do have a quick review with BAA level market power mitigation discussion with James. And then he'll hand it off to Nicole Selling from DMM, and also our manager, Ryan Kurlensky, who's also here as well, accompanying her for any questions for the data analysis, BAA level market power mitigation, and WEIM. And then after DMM presents, we will go ahead and hand it off to George. He'll be joining us soon, so we'll keep an eye out. He's coming in soon for the BA level market power mitigation 201 grouping approach. So that'll be around 10. And so then the last part will end things with the stakeholder engagement discussion on the BA level market power mitigation problem statements. So that would go ahead with one, and then we'll wrap things up with next steps as well. And then the next slide is just an overview of our initiative stakeholder process. And then we're currently on the working group phase. So we plan to have a new timeline visual coming soon. So want to give stakeholders heads up that that timeline is coming soon with additional visual cues of how our process is within the pre-proposal development phase as well as the proposal development phase. We thank everyone for those ongoing questions and comments. And then as well as a reminder for this call, we are aware that we are overlapping with another call for TPP. Unfortunately, we had to overlap today's call, but we will be expediting this recording. So that means that we will be having that recording video posted as soon as possible for today. And then we thank everyone for those who are able to attend. And I know we do our very best to not overlap meetings, but since the holidays are coming up, we definitely want to take advantage of this timeline and today's date. So we thank everyone for that. And then I think the last thing I wanted to state is that this presentation slides will be posted soon. So I'm working with comms to make sure those slides are up to date. So I'll send you guys all a chat once those slides are updated. But we did post the slides yesterday under policy initiatives, price formation enhancements. and under working group session 8, but we'll keep an eye out for that, and I'll send those 2 links out with the attendings list. So now I see everyone online. I'll go ahead and hand it off to Juan, and thanks so much for everyone for joining us today.
Okay, thank you, Brenda. If we could go ahead and move to the next slide. And as Brenda mentioned there, we wanted to make sure that we were able to get you guys the meat of the information that we'll be presenting today, but we are going to be updating that. We had a couple of smaller tweaks and an additional slide here. So what you'll see us presenting is just slightly different, but the data is not being different or changed at all. It's more kind of the information and reference material for you. So we'll have that posted on the initiative page here shortly. So this slide, I like bringing it up every time again. The purpose of the working group, let's define why we're here, and it's to lead to that action plan so that we can inform policy development. As Brenda's slide previous to this one showed, we are in that pre-initiative phase. So we're trying to capture all the perspectives here, and that will then be translated into the policy direction and the basis for the straw proposal for price formation enhancements. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide real quick here. Okay, so the working group progress to date from a progress perspective for BAA level MPM, you know, we put it on the agenda as a BAA level 201, kind of playing off of our 101 session. I think James did a wonderful job of providing the background on the way that the current BAA level market power mitigation construct exists. We're going to take a deeper dive here today. That's something that we heard from the stakeholder community, and we're happy to provide that so we can have a really informed discussion. So you'll see that I put done on here, but that's assuming we get through today, which I know we will. So issue and challenge identification problem statements, that's going to be in progress. That's later today in this session. I'm really looking forward to getting very active engagement from this community on what they see as considerations that we may need to take into account as we finalize those problem statements. And then we're going to get to the assessment. As Brenda mentioned, we are going to have a comment template. I know that we've used Slido before, we've used SurveyMonkey before. Now that we're kind of getting closer to finalizing some problem statements as it relates specifically to BAA level market power mitigation, we're going to put a comment template out. We're going to give plenty of time for organizations to be able to provide their thoughts. That will kind of be our next step here, and then we can move forward into the potential resolution. But we want to make sure that we both present the information that was requested from us, from those of you who have been participating in the sessions, providing that verbally, for those of you who participated in that SurveyMonkey and asked for specific slices of data to kind of paint this picture. We heard you. That's what we're addressing here today. And then from there, we can move into the resolution. So we got a lot of stuff here today for you guys. Raise your hand with questions. Very excited. I do want to echo what Brenda said. I know that we're conflicting right now with the TPP call. This is something that we try very hard not to do with the holidays and the constraints that we were facing just on scheduling. We do apologize for that, and we'll be sure that that doesn't occur again. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide, because I want to hand this off to James, taking a look at time here and make sure we have plenty of time for everything else. So the goal, right? What are we doing today? We talked about what we're doing with the working group. So what are we doing with today's session? So we're continuing those thematic sessions that we've outlined in the past. Today is BAA level market power mitigation. We're going to review that stakeholder requested data so we can inform that problem statement discussion at the end of this session. We heard you guys loud and clear through that SurveyMonkey that we needed to talk a little bit more about the grouping concept, right? Not getting to that solution, but we're starting to explore those concepts so we can start formulating those problem statements and moving forward. So we're going to explore the concepts of BAA grouping as a potential enhancement to BAA level market power mitigation, and then we're going to dive into those TISO drafted problem statements for this area. Now, these are meant to serve as conversation starters. We need that stakeholder feedback. Please share your positions, share if additional data is needed. Again, let's have measurable actions that come to mind when we're defining these problem statements. So I'm excited to be getting to this point of the discussion with you guys here. in the PFE working groups. So with that, let's go ahead and move to the next slide, and I'd like to hand this off to James Friedrich, the policy lead for this initiative, to just kind of recap how we got here when it comes to the BAA level discussion. So James, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juan, and good introduction. So I just wanted to put this slide out there for folks that may have been either new to the working groups or need a quick refresher on the progress that we made on this topic to date. And so this slide just generally shows links to working group sessions previous in which BA level market power was discussed, and in sort of shows the way today's session builds on where we have been in the past. Of course, in the first session, we sort of went over the PFE overview paper and introduced the topic of BA level market power as in scope for this initiative. In working group session 3, we talked a bit about BA level market power mitigation principles. And then working group session 4, we did a BA level MPM level set, which discussed some of the history of BA level market power within the Western EIM, which we hope was helpful. So this slide here just essentially, gives stakeholders a way to, if needed, after this discussion, to review some of these materials if it helps to understand what we talk about here today, and just to sort of see how we built on each session on this topic moving forward. So that's really all I wanted to say. So I'll pass it back to you, Juan.
Appreciate that, James, and thank you for walking through that. I think it's important. We're tackling 3 very kind of distinct areas in PFE working groups. We have scarcity pricing, we have fast start pricing, analysis scoping, and then we have the BA level market power mitigation. So this is one of those additional slides that I was referencing earlier as far as new reference material. You can kind of follow the evolution of this discussion along. We'll get that posted to the initiative page here shortly. So one of, a stakeholder in this group has been the Department of Market Monitoring here in DMM. And so we have invited Nicole Selling to present to us about some of the metrics of BA level mitigation within the WIM today, as it exists today. And we wanted to do, we thought this would be very valuable because it can paint the picture, because we're going to be going into the discussion about potential enhancements, right? We need to understand how it's operating today, that mechanism a little bit further. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And Nicole, I'd like to hand the floor over to you.
All right, thanks, Juan. I hope you all can hear me. As was mentioned, my name is Nicole, and I'm an analyst at the Department of Market Monitoring. So today, DMM has prepared some metrics that focus specifically on the BA level market power mitigation to provide some background on how this mechanism is currently implemented in the WEIM. So if we can go to the next slide. So as a reminder, BAA level mitigation protects areas from the potential exercise of market power whenever transfer constraints bind and create local areas within the larger system. So when WEIM transfers into a BAA or constrained, or in other words, that BAA is import constrained, this triggers a competitiveness assessment to determine whether or not that BAA can competitively satisfy its demand without additional WEIM imports. This test is done through the 3 pivotal supplier test. If the 3 pivotal supplier test identifies non-competitive conditions in that import constrained BAA, then all bids in that BAA are subject to mitigation. I will note that most BAAs in the WEIM are determined to be non-competitive whenever they are tested. This is due to the structure of most of the WEIM BAAs that don't have a large number of suppliers. It's important to emphasize here that when a resource is subject to mitigation, it is not always mitigated. The bids are only mitigated if they are higher than both the resource's default energy bid and the competitive locational marginal price. We'll note here that WEIM resources are also subject to local market power mitigation when they supply counterflow to non-competitive flow-based constraints within their own BAA. But primarily when WEIM resources are subject to mitigation, it is due to the triggering of this BAA level market power mitigation. We can go to the next slide. So here's an example of a resources bid along with its default energy bid and the competitive LMP. So we have the bid here in blue, the DEB in orange, and the competitive LMP in gray. Here we just really want to highlight that this bid is only going, if this bid is subject to mitigation, it is only going to be mitigated when it is higher than both its DEB and competitive LMP. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that the final bid that enters the market, the yellow bid here, the only portion of the bid that's mitigated was the final bid that was higher than both the competitive LMP and the DEB. And we go to the next slide. So this presentation is focused on BAA level mitigation that is currently done in the WEIM, and we'll be looking at several metrics that group by region as opposed to individual BAAs. DMM has defined these 4 regions based on geography along with trends of when these BAAs are import and export constrained. So you can see the 4 regions here, the Mountain Northwest, Desert Southwest, Pacific Northwest, and the California entities, and see where each of the WEIM BAAs fall into. And the data that we'll be looking at cover the time frame of January to October of this year. And we can go to the next slide. The first metrics that we'll be focused on look at the frequency and extent of BAA level mitigation. Here, the frequency is defined as the percentage of intervals where a BA is subject to mitigation. An interval where a BA is subject to mitigation implies that 1, that BA was import constrained, and 2, that BA was found to be non-competitive, which again is done through the 3 pivotal supplier tests, and generally WEIM BAs fail this test whenever they are subject to the test. The extent of mitigation defined here is the percent of megawatts that are subject to mitigation when the BAA level mitigation is triggered that are actually lowered during the mitigation process. Again, that implies that the bid was higher than both the resources DEB and competitive LMP. Here we can see some average DEBs by some resource types, noting that these resources won't get mitigated unless they're bidding over their estimated costs. So for example, a hydro resource would need to be bidding in excess of over about $200 on average in order to be lowered if that resource was subject to mitigation. And then we can go to the next slide. So here are the metrics that represent the average frequency and magnitude of BAA level mitigation for a BA in each of the regions. Just a quick note that 1 BA is dropped from these averages for the Pacific Northwest region. That is due to it being a substantial outlier in the percentage of intervals it is subject to mitigation, which I'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide. So looking at these metrics, the blue bars represent the average percent of intervals a BA in each of these regions is subject to mitigation, or the percentage of intervals where a BA is import constrained and failed the competitive test. We can see here that the frequency of the triggering of BAA level mitigation is fairly similar across RTPD and RTD. If we were to read one of the values off this figure, we can see that, for example, a BA in the Desert Southwest was import constrained and found to be non-competitive in about 7% of intervals and is thus subject to mitigation during those intervals. The green line here shows the extent of mitigation, or the percentage of megawatts that are actually lowered when these BAs are subject to mitigation. So for example, when a BA in the Desert Southwest region is subject to mitigation, about 14% of their megawatts are actually lowered. Taking these 2 statistics together, the takeaway would be for a BA in the Desert Southwest, subject to mitigation, subject to BAA level mitigation in about 7% of intervals, and in those 7% of intervals, about 14% of their bids are lowered due to that mitigation. So the next 4 slides have the same metric for each of the individual BAs in the 4 regions. So I was going to stop here for any questions about this particular metric before we look at them by BAA.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, no, if you have any questions, please feel free, raise your hand. All right, thank you, Callie. So let's go ahead and unmute Callie Wells from Goodwell. And sorry to give your name and affiliation in advance, Callie. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Callie Wells from WPTF. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Can you remind me when you guys were running your analysis, and I apologize if I missed this detail, when you say the BAA was import constrained, does that mean that just one of the transfer limits into that BAA was constrained, or all of them simultaneously constrained?
It is that the BAA level mitigation is, or the testing that leads to BAA level mitigation is triggered whenever the power balance constraint, the shadow price of the power balance constraint is greater than 0 for that BA. So the BA shadow price is greater than 0. Does that answer your question?
I think so. So that would mean just anytime one of the transfer limits into that area were constrained, that causes that price separation.
Yes, whenever there's price separation. I'm not entirely sure I understand your question, but yeah, whenever there's price separation between the shadow prices of the two BAs, then that's whenever the BA is tested for, I think I see Ryan's got his hand up. Ryan, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, hey, yeah, thanks. Yeah, Callie, so an area can have its BA power balance constraint elevated if it's isolated by itself, or if it's in a group of other BAAs then that whole group is constrained, right, from other regions. So so if say there's two transfer constraints into a single BAA, if just one is binding, another one isn't, that area won't be separated by congestion from the rest of the WIM. And so, so if in that scenario, if there's two transfer limits into transfer constraints into one BA, both of those would have to be binding for that area to be separated. But that area could also be subject to mitigation if it's part of a group of other BAs, and all the transfer limits into that group of BAs are binding. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. But this analysis, though, isn't doing the grouping method, right? Because that's a potential enhancement. This is looking at just how it's done in Wien today. Or did you guys do a grouping analysis here?
Well, no, but I mean, so this is looking at when it's, when a balancing area is subject to mitigation currently, and that's when its power balance constraint is elevated. And so it's, a single BA's power balance constraint, shadow price can be positive, even if it's part of a group of BAAs that are separated from the rest, from say from CAISO due to congestion or transfer constraints.
Got it. Okay, thank you. That's what that was my understanding, but I just wanted to confirm. Thanks.
Thanks.
All right, thanks, Callie, and thanks, Ryan, for jumping in there. Not seeing any more questions, I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. So as I mentioned here, we have the same metric. Oh, I'm sorry, I heard someone say something. Maybe not. Okay, sorry about that. We've got the same metric for each individual BAA in the 4 regions. So again, the blue bars show the frequency of BAA level mitigation, and the line here shows the extent of mitigation when those areas are subject to mitigation. Here we're looking at the Pacific Northwest region. So as you can see, this one BA here at the end is subject to mitigation much more frequently than the others, which is why it was dropped from our average in the previous slide. This is because this BA is more frequently import constrained, which leads to increased intervals where that resource is subject to mitigation. And we can just go through the next couple of slides quickly. When we're looking at the other regions, we can see that there is heterogeneity in how frequently these BAs are import constrained and found to be non-competitive, and what percentage of their bids are lowered when subject to mitigation. So if we could go to the next slide, and the slide after that. And now the slide after that. So now we're going to be looking at the trends of when BA level mitigation is triggered across hours and months. So the hourly profile here of when BAs in the 4 regions are subject to mitigation indicate that BAA level market power mitigation is more frequently triggered during the midday hours. This is particularly true for the Northwest regions. This is likely due to the high level of cheap imports available during these hours, thus leading these BAs to be import constrained. Again, most of the time a BA is tested for competitiveness because it is import constrained. That test shows that the BA is non-competitive. So when a BA is import constrained, it is likely going to be subject to mitigation as it is not able to competitively meet its demand. The next slide assesses the frequency of BAs being subject to BAA level market power mitigation across months. On average, BAs are more frequently subject to mitigation during the shoulder months, so spring and fall. Again, this is likely due to the availability of cheap imports during these months compared to the summer months. Any questions here before I move on to some different metrics?
All right, so if you have any questions, feel free to just raise your hand. If you're dialed in, that would be #2. So let's give it a moment, Nicole, but right now I'm not seeing anyone. Okay, yeah, nope, no hands raised, Nicole. Why don't you go ahead and continue?
All right, sounds good. So before we get to the last set of metrics, just going to review some terminology here. So when we're talking about megawatts that are subject to mitigation, when we're talking about BAA level market power mitigation, that's going to be the entirety of the BA supply when it is 1, import constrained, and 2, failed the structural test. The amount of megawatts that were mitigated referred to the quantity of bids that were actually lowered in the mitigation process. Again, bids are only lowered if they were higher than both the competitive LMP and the resource's default energy bid. Lastly, we have the potential increase in megawatts due to mitigation, and what this focus on is the supply bids that were lowered enough to potentially cause additional dispatch from that resource. So if we go to the next page, this metric may look familiar. It's in line with those that DMM publishes in the annual report. It's looking at the average incremental and energy mitigation in the WEIM across all intervals. So these values take into account both the frequency and the magnitude of mitigation. So as you can see here, the average megawatt subject to mitigation in the WEIM, focusing specifically on that that's due to BAA level mitigation, is the highest in October with about 6,000 megawatts subject to mitigation on average. Just to put this into context, this is out of almost 90,000 megawatts of participating capacity in the WEIM. I just want to note here that this is not looking at CAISO, as the CAISO is not currently subject to BAA level market power mitigation. So here we're just looking at the other WEIM entities. Out of those 6,000 megawatts that were subject to mitigation on average in October, about 800 megawatts were actually lowered. We can see here on the next slide where I sort of blow up the portion of the previous metric and it's looking specifically, if we go to the next slide, sorry. At the average amount of the bids were actually changed due to BAA level mitigation. So as I mentioned in October, it looks like about 800 megawatts on average had their bids lowered, a small percentage of which could have led to an increase in that resource's dispatch due to the lower bid, which we could see here in red. I've provided the same set of metrics for each of the 4 regions as well in the appendix of these slides. I won't go over all of the regions individually, but the slides are provided in case they're of interest. But overall, the trend is the same within the different areas as it is in the WEIM. A small percentage of the participating capacity is subject to mitigation on average, and a smaller percentage is actually mitigated to lower prices in those instances of mitigation. And those are all of the prepared slides that I have. Like I said, there's some additional metrics in the appendix, but I will stick around for any other questions.
Very good. Thank you so much, Nicole. And as you mentioned, in the appendix, there are the regional breakdowns of these data slices. So let's go ahead and take some questions. James, I see your hand up. Please go ahead.
Hi there, and hi, Nicole. Thanks so much for preparing this. Really useful information and information that stakeholders have been requesting in this working group process. So hopefully stakeholders found this insightful. I just want to try to tie a bow on this a little bit and connect it to our next speaker. So George is going to be talking about a grouping approach. And maybe we can sort of opine quickly on, given this information, what sort of metrics might we think be affected by a move towards a grouping approach? Let's think about that for a second. So one, of course, is the frequency of failure relative to today, right? And you mentioned that today, almost all the time, when a WEAM entity is tested, they fail the DCPA. And presumably, the grouping approach would reduce that quantity by grouping BAs together as groups, and you have additional supply counterflow to help you meet the, or supply to meet the 3 pivotal supplier tests. Would you agree with that? And are there any other metrics that we should be thinking about as potential for change in the grouping approach? Thank you.
Sure. So yeah, that's been my understanding, as the grouping approach would lead to more instances where BAs are found competitive as a group, even though they may not be competitive when tested individually. So it might change the pattern that we're seeing now, where anytime a BA is import constrained, it's almost always subject to mitigation. With a grouping approach, it sounds like there may be instances where there's more instances where a BA is maybe import constrained, but it's found to be competitive when grouped with more BAs and thus not subject to mitigation in those intervals where it was import constrained.
All right. No, thanks for that, Nicole. I see we do have a hand up from Brian. Let's go ahead and unmute Brian, please.
Nicole, this is Brian Thaker with Middle River Power. Thank you for your presentation. Your last slide, average monthly megawatt mitigation, seems a bit counterintuitive, because I think intuitively one might expect that mitigation would be higher in months where load is higher and therefore less available supply. Do you have off the top of your head an explanation why the spring months in October tend to show higher levels of mitigation?
Yeah, one of the reasons that we think to show that, explain the trends that we see in those months, as well as, the hourly profile, is really the presence of cheap imports available to those areas. And the more those BAs are import constrained, the more they'll be tested for competitiveness. And since they generally fail that test, by and large, more intervals of being import constrained lead to more intervals of being subject to mitigation. And so I think that's what's driving that trend there.
Thank you. Just as a reminder, when we do unmute you, don't mute yourself back. In case you want to kind of continue on, you will have to raise your hand again. But thank you very much for the question, Brian. Are there any other questions for Nicole on the data that she has provided us here? Callie, thank you. Let's go ahead and unmute Callie, please.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. I actually had a similar thought as Brian as to, it's interesting to me that the highest level of mitigation occurs in months you would not expect it to. And it also sounded like in hours you would not expect it to. And so I understand kind of your theory that it's just cheaper renewable that's available to be imported into that area is causing the mitigation to be triggered. But I think one of the benefits of having these working group meetings, I'm not suggesting that we, hash this out now or have this discussion, but I think it would be good to tee this up later, is because we are talking about problems with the existing mechanism, is is that appropriate? I don't have, you know, I'm not convinced one way or the other right now, but it's a thought that came to mind is it appropriate to be triggering mitigation on the BAA just because there's cheap solar and, you know, solar and wind available from other BAAs? So just a thought, and I don't know if it makes sense maybe in one of the following working groups to kind of think through that a little bit more, because I think depending on that answer will depend on if and what type of changes we should be considering in the policy process. And maybe this grouping mechanism that George is going to talk about might help with that, but there might be an alternative way to address this, or even I think the threshold question of does it actually need to be addressed still is a big question in our minds. So just wanted to throw that out there. I had the same reaction as Brian, just something to think through.
Okay, great. Yeah, I appreciate that comment. Like you said, don't want to speak to it now. Need to do some more analysis there, but potentially something worth looking into. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and thanks for the analysis.
Thanks for that, Callie. Sorry, Callie, didn't mean to. I'm having a little bit of delay, so I apologize in advance if I step on anybody. I think that's the third time I've done that here today. So apologies for past and future occurrences of that. So Callie noted, we will definitely take that into future conversations. Really appreciate the engagement and the comment there, and I'll echo what you said in thanking Nicole for the analysis. We are going to have, again, the comment template and the reference material for you guys to take a look at. We're going to provide an ample amount of time on the comments following the session. So I appreciate that feedback, Callie, and we hope that everybody kind of considers these things and provides their perspective via that comment template or here in the session. So any other questions for Nicole before we move on to a couple conceptual grouping approaches, kind of that BAA level market power mitigation 201 from George Angelidis here? Okay, well, Nicole, thank you very much. Event producer, if we could please give George presenter rights. I believe he's going to need to be able to project his own deck there. So if we could just kind of pull this down, give George the presenter rights, and then George, thank you very much for joining us here today to talk about these concepts. We'll give the floor to you. So feel free to go ahead and share your deck whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. This is George Angelidis with the ISO, and we're going to talk about this BAA group methodology for market power mitigation. We'll do a quick review of what we have today for LMPM and the current BAA level mitigation in EIM that we extend in EDAM, and then we'll proceed to discuss how we could potentially enhance that with the BAA grouping method. And at the end, we'll raise some questions, have a Q&A and discussion. Let's move on, and I'll switch to the presentation mode here. So let me see. Can you guys see this? Yeah, okay. So a quick review of how we perform the local market power mitigation today and day ahead, and we have some changes coming for DAME and EDAM. We have a dedicated market power mitigation pass before we run RFM. We use the DCPA RSI3 methodology for evaluating binding constraints. Now we have 3 scenarios with DAME, base scenario and the imbalance reserve up and down deployment scenario. So any binding constraint in any of these scenarios will be evaluated. RSI3 is your resource supply index methodology, where we use the 3 pivotal suppliers for evaluating competitiveness for these constraints. And then we proceed to mitigate energy bids and imbalance reserve up bids above the competitive LMP for energy or the competitive imbalance reserve up marginal price. And these are bids from supply resources that they provide counterflow to binding uncompetitive constraints. So initially, when we launch them, we will not perform any imbalance reserve up mitigation because it's not necessary since we have a $55 cap for bids, but we have it in the design for later if we need it. After we perform this market power mitigation pass, of course, we run the AFM. Now we're using the mitigated energy and, if applicable, imbalance reserve up bids. Now with them, we introduce another market power mitigation pass before RAC because we have reliability capacity bids that are going to be used in RAC. Of course, initially, because we also have a $55 cap for reliability capacity bids, we will not perform this market power mitigation pass, but we have it in the design if we need to activate it later on. It does exactly the same thing. We only have one scenario in RAC where simultaneously reliability capacity up and reliability capacity down are deployed. So any binding constraints are tested for competitiveness using, again, the same RSI3 methodology. And then we proceed to mitigate reliability capacity up bids, again, above the competitive reliability capacity up marginal price. And these are the bids that they provide counterflow again to binding uncompetitive constraints. And following that, we run RAC with the mitigated RCU bids. Things are essentially the same, what we have in EIM. The structure is a little bit different. We have a dedicated market power mitigation pass for the FMM. It does exactly the same things. We have, again, base scenario and flexible ramp up and flexible ramp down deployment scenarios. So any constraint that is binding in any of the scenarios is tested with the TCPA RSI3 methodology for competitiveness. And then we proceed to mitigate energy bids above competitive LMP and also flexible ramp up bids above the competitive flexible ramp up marginal price that they provide counterflow to binding uncompetitive constraints. Same methodology, the mechanism is a little different. We proceed to run FMM with the mitigated energy and flexible ramp up bids. Sorry, we don't have flexible ramp bids in EIM, so the mitigation is only for energy bids, as I say in the slides. I went too fast on this one. Now, the mitigation for the RTD is a little different. We don't have a dedicated market power mitigation pass for RTD. The RTD runs every 5 minutes, so we don't have the time to do that. So we're actually doing it in the previous RTD run, where we test and mitigate the bids for the advisory intervals that will be used in the next RTD. So we piggyback from one RTD to the next without a dedicated pass for MPM, but the methodology is still the same. We still mitigate bids that they have counterflow to binding constraints that are uncompetitive in any of the three scenarios, base and the FRU, FRD deployment scenarios. And then we run RTD with a mitigated energy bid. So this is where we are, what we have for local market power mitigation. This is just a recap here to go to the next slide, where we're going to discuss what we're doing in addition to LMPM. We have a methodology currently that is applied in EIM, and we're extending it to EDM based on our design for BAA market power mitigation. The principle for that is the same as the LMPM. So we still use the TCPA RSI3 methodology to evaluate the competitiveness of now the power balance constraint. So that's the constraint that is always binding for its BAA because we enforce the power balance. It's an equality constraint. So that is always binding. So this methodology checks to see if that constraint is competitive. And if the constraint is competitive, that means that you have competitive supply in the BAA to meet the demand. It's exactly the same methodology as in LMPM. However, the supply counterflow includes all the supply schedules because every supply resource contributes to the power balance constraint with a shift factor of -1. So they're all together. So the entire supply is your supply counterflow. And the demand for counterflow, these are the two elements that are used in the RSI3 methodology. That's the schedule load in IFM, because we're extending this methodology to EDM, or the demand forecast if we're running rack or the real-time market. So with these mechanical changes, the methodology and the philosophy is still the same. If the constraints, if the power balance constraint is not competitive, then we proceed to mitigate all supply bids above the competitive LMP. The interesting part in this methodology is how we trigger that evaluation. So the trigger here that we use currently in EIM, and we propose to expand it in DAME and EDM, is when the power balance constraint shadow price for the BAA under evaluation, which is the marginal energy component of the LMP, is higher than the marginal energy component in the ISO balancing authority area. And that happens presumably because there is import transfer congestion at some interface between the ISO to the BAA in question. It may not be on a direct transfer, it could be somewhere in between. And that creates a price separation with the BAA marginal energy cost being higher than the ISO. So that triggers the evaluation for mitigation for that BAA. So obviously that methodology takes the ISO balancing authority area as a reference, assuming that it is a competitive BAA. And then the mitigation evaluation applies independently to each BAA that meets that triggering condition. The issue that we have seen with this is that because the evaluation applies independently to each BAA, that ignores BAAs that actually have the same marginal energy cost and they separate from the ISO as a group. Testing them independently, you may run into a scenario where the RSI3 methodology fails for an independent BAA in that group, but if you're testing that group in its entirety, the RSI3 may be above 1, which means that the group is actually a competitive chunk of the market footprint. And since there is no marginal energy cost difference between these BAAs in the group, there is no transfer congestion, which means that energy can freely be exchanged between any BAA in the group. So they're actually acting as a segregated sub-market from the market footprint. So we believe that testing these BAAs independently ignores the fact that they are actually in a market group together and there is energy flow that is not constrained between them. Grouping them and testing them as a group may provide advantage to these BAAs because you have more economies of scale. A larger group, it's potentially easier to pass the RSI3 because you have more suppliers in the entire group. Easier or not easier, it doesn't matter. We believe that it's probably the more appropriate way to test because these groups, these BAAs in the group, they're all in one sub-market. We shouldn't be separating them and testing them separately. So that's the motivation to propose an enhancement to this methodology. And in this enhancement, we call it BAA grouping or BAA group market power mitigation. We will not use the ISO balancing authority area as competitive. We don't need a reference BAA to perform this evaluation. So the ISO is treated like any BAA. So we have an even level among the BAAs. And in this methodology, we group the BAAs in the market footprint, whether it's EDAM or EIM, that they have equal marginal energy cost, which means that they separate together as a group price-wise from the rest of the market footprint. Again, equal marginal energy cost means that there are no transfer constraints between these BAAs, so there is free energy flow in transfers between them. Now, as a detail here, we only, propose to group them if there is a direct transfer connection among the BAs in the group. That's a minor detail because if there is no direct transfer connection, it's probably very unlikely that they will end up having the same marginal energy cost. But anyway, topologically, since this method has some topology principles in it, we will make sure that we're not grouping disjoint BAAs because they happen to have equal marginal energy cost. After we do this grouping, and we have now BAA groups at different marginal energy costs, we sort them in a descending order of marginal energy cost. So the top group is the highest price group. And because it's the highest priced group in terms of the marginal energy cost, of course, that is an import constrained group. All right, so the imports into that group are constrained. There is some transfer congestion across the interface of that group with the rest of the market footprint, and it's import constrained to that group. Similarly, the bottom group, the lower price group, is export constrained, meaning that the transfer interface at the boundary of that group with the rest of the market footprint is constrained in the export direction, and that's why that group has the lowest marginal energy cost. For intermediate groups in intermediate price ranges, what happens is that these are import constrained from lower price groups and export constrained to higher price groups. So there is a hierarchy that is established between the BA groups depending on how the marginal energy cost of these groups rank. Once we have all that, then the methodology that we propose is very methodical. We propose to start from the top BAA group, that's the higher priced group, and then progressively move downwards. Now, every time we move downwards, okay, so we test first the first group, all right? We find out if it's competitive or not, all right? If it's not competitive, then we move downward. We find the next group, all right? And we add that next group to the higher price groups. We merge it in, again, only if there's a direct transfer connection, right? We don't want to group BAAs that are disjoint. And then we perform the RSI test for the expanded BAA group now. So it includes more BAAs. So every step that we go down, the group potentially expands, and we do the test, the RSI3 test, on an ever-increasing in size group of BAAs. So at every step when we perform the test, if the test fails, then we mark the energy bids for the resources in that group that we added for market power mitigation, okay? We don't perform the market power mitigation yet because we don't know what is the competitive LMP. We'll find that in following steps. The competitive LMP will be determined when the RSI test passes in a following step for a larger group. So that happens if the RSI test fails. And I'll have some examples that will go this a little bit slower with examples. So if the RSI test passes, as we go down, we find a group that we added, and then the expanded group now passes the RSI test. That means the group now, the expanded group, is competitive. So the group that we added, we don't mitigate now, right? Because it joins a group and a bigger group, and now the expanded group is competitive. And this group that was added and made the whole expanded group competitive now sets the competitive LMP. The MEC for that group is the competitive LMP for higher price BAA. So now we can go back and use that to mitigate the bids for the higher price BAAs that failed the test. And we could either stop here or we could continue adding groups. And it's more likely that the more groups you add, you have a competitive group from now on. But we can still continue grouping, and if the RSI test keeps passing, then there's no mitigation. If for some reason we add the last group, the lowest price group, and we still don't have a competitive BA group, which is now the entire market footprint, still fails the RSI test for the entire market footprint, then that means that we don't have any competitive condition. There is no competitive LMP, in which case now we mitigate all the energy bits for the entire market footprint above zero, right? There's no competitive LMP. So that's obviously a very unlikely scenario we want to think. So this is the description of the methodology. I'm going to go through an example so that we can see how this works out visually. So you see here 9 BAAs, and they're all having potentially different marginal energy costs. All right, so first step is, we rank them. The BAA1 is the highest price BAA at $30. So that's your first grouping. All right, and then the next is BAA3 and BAA4 at $25. These are grouped together, right? Because there's a direct transfer connection and they're at the same price of $25. So step 2 has 3 and 4 together. Then the next BAA in merit order of the marginal energy cost is BAA2 at $20. Now, there is no direct connection with 3 and 4 with 2, so we group BAA2 with BAA1. So step 3 has BAA1 and BAA2 in the group. Then we bring BAA5, which is at $15, and that joins the previously disjoint group. So now at that step 4, we have all BAAs 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the expanded group. So we perform the RSI for that group. Then the next step will bring in together BAA7 and BAA9, which they are at $12. So that's the expanded group. And then at the end, we also bring BAA6 and BAA8, and we have now all the BAAs in the market footprint in one big group. So these are the grouping steps, how we proceed through the algorithm, if you wish, for the testing in the grouping. Let's see some examples of how the test might turn. So in this example, we say in the first step, where we test BAA1, the RSI 3 test comes out to be less than 1, which is a failure, meaning BAA1 is not competitive. So we mark BAA1 for mitigation. We don't know the competitive LMP yet, so we just mark it. We'll get back to it. Next step, we check 3 and 4. All right, and the group of 3 and 4, we don't test them individually. That's the essence of the proposal. We test them as a group. I would say that the group passes. So 3 and 4 consist of a competitive group. So 3 and 4 bids are not mitigated. All right. Then we go to step 3 and we test BAAs 1 and 2 together, because in that step you have that group. Let's assume that they fail. So now BAA2 is also marked for mitigation, because that group is still not competitive. And then in step 4, we bring in BAA5, which groups all together now. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 as a group. And in this example, let's say that this group passes. So that means BAA5, we will not mitigate it, right? And BA5 will set the LMP at $15, the competitive LMP for all the previous mitigations. James, you have a question? I see you have.
Yeah, I just want to, thanks. Not so much a question, but I'd like to pause on this slide to emphasize that I think it does a good job of showing the difference here between a grouping approach and the status quo, in which today, let's say, for example, BA5 is the CAISO. That means that BAs 1, 2, 3, and 4, who all have power balance constraint shadow prices higher than CAISO or $15, are all going to be tested individually. And the status quo might mean that BA3 and BA4, who under the grouping approach are found to be competitive as a group, they may be found non-competitive individually. And so that's the primary emphasis of the grouping approach, is that you may, as we said earlier, may result in more appropriate pass-fail determinations. Does that sound right to you, George?
Yes, that's a very good observation, James. Thank you. That's it's very good. That's exactly the difference that we're looking with this enhancement. So, as you said, 3 and 4 would have been mitigated because simply they're higher than the ISO BAA if the ISO is BA5, and maybe individually they fail the RSI test. Although if you group them, as you should, because they're at the same price, there's no congestion between those two. It's like you have one group of 2 BAAs. If they pass as a group, then we could be over mitigating as a result of testing them independently. So going back to this example, that's a good remark. Thank you, James. So going back to this example, when we bring BAA5 into this mix and we test all of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 as a group, and we find that the group passes, BA5 will not be mitigated because we say now it joins a group and the entire group becomes competitive. And we also find the competitive LMP being the marginal energy cost of this last added group, which is $15. So now we can go back to 1 and 2 that we marked them for mitigation. Now that we know the competitive LMP, which is 15 in this example, we can go and mitigate those bids. And then we can proceed if there's a need for it. Doesn't cost anything. We can proceed, although we expect now the mitigation not be necessary since we add more supply. We also add more demand though. So we can proceed. We can add 7 and 9. I assume that the entire group now that includes 1 through 5 and 7 and 9, it passes, and then we can also add 6 and 8, and we find that they pass. So basically, the mitigation here is limited to BA1 and BA2 in this approach. And we want to see here another example, which is also interesting. Let me go to that example. So as before, but now let's assume that when we bring BAA5, and we have now an expanded group of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, that this entire group fails the RSI-3 test, which means that BA5 is not competitive even when we add it to the other 4 and form an expanded group. So here BA5 will be also marked for mitigation, all right? And then now we're still looking for the competitive LMP. So when we add 7 and 9, and now this entire group to the top right, that includes 5, 7, 9, and the ones on the top, is passing, then the competitive LMP is $12. So now we go back to BAAs 1, 2, and 5 that we marked for mitigation, and we mitigate the energy bids based on the competitive LMP of $12. Now, to parallel this with a comment that James made in the previous example, assume that BA5 is the ISO BAA. So you can see that with this BAA group mitigation proposal, we don't treat the ISO as any special BAA. If ISO was BAA 5, and after joining ISO with the other BAAs, the entire group is still not competitive, that means we'll mitigate the ISO energy bids. So there is no, if you wish, special treatment for the ISO BAA. We treat all BAAs the same. Let me stop here and see if there are any questions before I go to the last slide where I actually raise questions myself.
Thank you, George. JK has her hand up, but let's go ahead and unmute JK, please.
Can you hear me?
Hi, JK. We could briefly. There we go. Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much, George. I think the graph, the example you gave here really helps. Just want to clarify some assumptions here. So when you group those BAAs, and the cascaded order we have here is based on price and based on interconnection, right? So let's say you test so where you group BA1 and 2, it's both because the order of the price and they are interconnected. Let's say there is another BAA who also have a $20, but not connected to BA1, you will not group those two. Is that right?
Right, for the same reason that we don't group 3 and 4 with 1 on step 2, because the next BAA after 1 is the group 3 and 4 at 25. Sorry, the group 3 and 4 we don't. Okay, maybe if I change the prices, going to be if I swap the 20 with the 25, then yeah, you don't group BAAs that they don't have a direct interconnection, because the whole idea of the grouping assumes that you don't have transfer congestion between the BAAs that you're grouping, and therefore you have unconstrained energy flow, so they consist of a sub-market. If there is no direct transfer congestion, you have to go through another BAA, and there are constraints, either import or export constraints when you involve that BAA, then that violates this principle. Now, as I said earlier, it's very unlikely for BAAs, mathematically, that are not directly connected to have the same marginal energy cost, that you have the same marginal price in unconnected disjoint BAAs. That's mathematically almost an impossibility. They always rank one higher than the other, but as a general rule, you don't want to be grouping BAAs or BAA groups that they don't have a direct connection. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. And my second question is, it seems there is assumption that we assume if the higher price group, if the higher priced group is competitive, its lower priced group in its hierarchy is also competitive. So for example, like at step 2, BAA 3 and 4 pass, so there's no mitigation. Does that mean that let's say if BA5 is the only one that's connected to them, then it will not be checked for competitiveness as well?
I don't want to make that assumption. And this example here is interesting, that you see that although the group 1 through 5 in step 4 is not competitive, the subgroup of 3 and 4 that we tested in step 2 is still competitive. So we won't mitigate the bids in 3 and 4 because that's a competitive group. Even if the expanded group that we bring this BAAs in is uncompetitive, this means that although these 3 and 4 BAAs as a group are competitive, joining the higher group, they don't make this higher group competitive. So there is still mitigation for BAAs 1, 2, and 5, but we still won't mitigate 3 and 4 because by themselves, they're a competitive chunk of the market footprint. So that's an interesting concept. So going down the hierarchy, you can't always assume that, whenever you find, um, when you add a BAA to the expanded group and you find it competitive, it's reasonable to assume that adding more BAAs in the next steps will probably, they're all going to still be competitive. We don't have to make this assumption. It doesn't cost much from a performance standpoint to actually continue the algorithm. It's possible that in the previous example where we find the group of 1 through 5 being competitive, setting the LMP at 15, in the next step where we bring in 7 and 9, well, that group could be non-competitive, in which case now we'll mitigate 7 and 9, although we will not mitigate 5, 3, and 4. So in general, I mean, we could perform the algorithm without stopping and making any assumptions. And because it doesn't cost much, that's what we're proposing.
Okay, so let me try to reiterate and make sure I understand what you say. So for all the groups in the hierarchy, we'll do the test, no matter whether the higher priced group is competitive or not. So that's to say, even the higher priced group is competitive, we continue to do the test for the whole combination of the group. Is that right?
Yes. So in this example, let's say BA1, which is the highest price group, let's say we find out it's competitive. Yes, it's import constrained. That's because of the economics of the solution, but there's still sufficient supply to meet the demand competitively in BA1, even if it's import constrained. That's why we're testing, right? So let's say BA1 is competitive. So we won't mitigate BA1, then we go to BA2 in step 3, and we say BA2 is connected to BA1. So now instead of testing BA2 independently, we test 1 and 2 together, right? And even though 1 was competitive, we may find out that adding BA2, the group of 1 and 2 is non-competitive, which means we have to mitigate BA2, even though we don't have to mitigate BA1. So following the hierarchy, we can still make a good judgment call on whether the BAA or the BA group that we add needs to be mitigated or not, without making any assumptions depending on what happened to the previous grouping test.
Okay, got you. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so that actually answers my question very well. I think I agree with the completeness of you're going through all the BAs, because there were examples when you have a higher price groups competitive, the lower group the BA could be non-competitive. But when you test the competitiveness of BA2, you consider it in the greater group together with BA1 instead of testing individually. So it would not exclude BA1 because considering it's exporting to BA1. Is that the right way to think about it?
No, well, let me explain. So at the NPM solution, at the NPM pass solution, BA1 is import constrained. So the transfer between 2 to 1 is binding. Okay, right. That means that BA1 is import constrained. But when you test BA2, BA1 can export to BA2, right? BA2 is not import constrained from BA1, it's export constrained to BA1. BA2 and BA1 together as a group are import constrained from the other BAA, so we test BA1 and BA2 as a group to see if it's competitive. The fact that BA1 can export to BA2 tells us that we should not be testing BA2 independently, because the competitiveness of serving the demand in 1 and 2, it depends on the supply in both 1 and 2. They can actually, the transfer which is constrained in the solution can actually be reversed in IFM, right? So the whole idea is that you find the import constrained group from other BAA. So BA1 and BA2 are import constrained, but BA2 on its own, it's not import constrained because it can get energy from BA1. So that's why you test them together in a group.
I thought
Make sense?
BA2 is exporting to BA1 because it has a lower price. The energy will from,
Correct.
well, okay.
Yes. Yes, it's exporting to BA1, but BA1, it was competitive in this example we're talking about. So it has sufficient competitive supply to meet the demand and potential could export. So when you test, when you want to test BA2 for competitiveness, you should test BA1 and BA2 together because BA2 is not import constrained from BA1. BA1 can actually provide supply energy to meet the demand BA2. So you want to see if BA2 along with BA1 form a competitive group. That's what the difference is in the BA grouping methodology. You don't test BAs independently. You only test import constrained groups. So here the BA1, BA2 group is import constrained, but BA2 on its own, it's not import constrained.
Okay, well, thanks for your explanation. I think, you know, in terms of the logic and assumptions, it's much more clear to me now. Thank you very much. And quick question, and you mentioned that you think computationally, you think it will be feasible to do that among all the BAAs if we check all of the groups.
Yeah, you know, I haven't really, we haven't done the design. This is just a proposal at this level, and it does involve certain topological aspects, which can be difficult to code, but I don't think it will be a problem. Things like that have been done in the past. It's not difficult to topologically find out how the connection between the BAs are and perform these steps in this sequence that we described.
Okay. Yeah, I wondered that because, you know, topologically, if you have all the combination, it will be exponential, but maybe because the price actually showed up, it's not that much separation. So, all right. Thank you very much, George.
Thank you.
Thank you, JK. And I heard our principle, if we go way back, of feasibility there. So I appreciate that. But again, we are kind of going through the concept here. We'll be diving into that portion of the discussion here a little bit later in the session. So this is a great discussion. I see two hands up. Let's go to James first, and then Ryan will go to you.
Everybody, and hey George, thanks a lot, and JK also thank you, because some of your questions sort of put some clarity in my mind, and I want to try. I've got a series of sort of rhetorical questions for you, George, that I think are intended to help emphasize a certain element of this design, which is I think that one of the key questions is, when does the algorithm stop? And I'm going to ask a few questions to help us think about some different ways to think about that. So can we go back to the, I don't see your slides anymore, George.
Yeah, George, if you wouldn't mind projecting your deck again.
Yeah, let me see if I can do it. Somehow it went off the sharing. I'm going to reshare. All right, you can see it?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so question number one. So BA1 is the highest price BA in the group. And if we assume BA1 is competitive and we don't extend the proposal was not to continue to test as was suggested by others, then if BA1 as the highest price group was competitive, you would not test BA3 and the algorithm would stop, correct? I mean, that's one decision to be made.
Yeah, so again, I don't recommend doing that because of the fact that there are BA groups that are not connected. So here, for example, 3 and 4, although they're below 1 in price, they're not directly connected to 1. So even if 1 is competitive, you cannot simply assume that every BAA below is also competitive because you say, okay, we're going to add them to BA1, you have a bigger group. Well, you may not be able to add them because they're disconnected, they're disjoint. That's one problem. But even if you add them, like in our example that we're talking with JK, even if BAA1 is competitive and you add BAA2 to test 1 and 2 together, 1 and 2 may fail, which means that BAA1 is competitive. We shouldn't mitigate bits for BAA1, but BAA2 is not competitive because even when we test 1 and 2 together, there's no competitive conditions in the group of 1 and 2, so therefore 2 is not competitive. So I think it's convenient to say if the structure topologically of the system is such that every BAA is connected to others, then going down this list, adding BAAs, once we find a group that's competitive, you can reasonably assume that maybe, you should stop here. Adding more BAs is just going to make even more competitive the entire group. I don't think we need to make this assumption. I think it's safer to continue going all the way to the end and test at the end the entire market footprint, which should be competitive, but it doesn't hurt once you have the methodology in the group to make any assumptions that could compromise your outcome. I don't think it's necessary to do that.
Thank you. Yeah, that helps a lot. And then I also want to bring in BA5 again and imagine that BA5 is the KISO, because one of the other assumptions inherent in this methodology is that if BA5 were the KISO, we're testing it just like everybody else. Now the status quo, that's not the way it works today, where KISO is the reference for competitiveness always in the BA level test today. And so one other sort of thing to think about is whether or not that assumption should stay does, I think, change potentially your algorithm, because if you were to operate on the assumption that BA5, which is the KISO in this example, was always competitive, then it probably doesn't make sense to continue the algorithm down to 7 and 9 and 6 and 8, for example. So you would stop whenever you get to a group where the KISO is part of it. And it also might have an impact.
I wouldn't do it. You can continue. I mean, even if BA5 is the ISO, and you say the ISO is competitive, so you can make a leap of faith here that the entire group 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is competitive because you added the ISO, and I don't need to test. Well, that doesn't mean that if you add 7 and 9, first of all, it doesn't mean that the ISO is competitive, because the entire group 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 may be not competitive. So if you make an assumption that it's competitive, say, okay, I'm not going to test that, then not testing the expanded group with 7 and 9 is an additional assumption. So, I mean, you may find out that the entire group from 1 through 5 plus 7 plus 9 is not competitive. Even though you made the assumption that the ISO is not competitive, that doesn't mean that the ISO is competitive. That doesn't mean the 7 and 9 group is competitive. I think you should go ahead and test everything too, so that you don't make any assumptions at all in this process.
Mm-hmm. And that's a fair response. And all I'm trying to point out is that the assumption about the KISO's treatment relative to the status quo, where in this case, if we're not doing a grouping approach in this case with these same prices, BA7, 9, 8, and 6, with shadow prices lower than the KISO would not be tested ever. And then under the grouping approach, it might be appropriate to continue the algorithm to include those BAs who today would not be tested. So yeah,
that's
some
right,
variations to think about.
Yeah, if every BA has enough supply to meet its demand, meaning that they pass the RSC, then it's reasonable to assume that if you add a BAA to a larger group, now the expanded group is competitive because you add more supply than demand. But why making that assumption? Because maybe the BAA you're adding is actually failed the RSC. It doesn't have sufficient supply to meet its demand. So now when you add it to the expanded group, you add more demand than supply. So now the resulting situation for that expanded group may make it non-competitive. So I think unless we're really driven by performance constraints that we want to stop this algorithm early, I wouldn't recommend that. I don't think it's worthwhile to make this kind of assumptions. Once you have the methodology in place, just let it run its course.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope that just gives a few different angles to be looking at this problem.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, I appreciate those questions, James, and responses, George. And again, yeah, I think this is great for everybody to begin thinking about it. Again, we're answering two problem statements here, and you know, with the California ISO's inclusion into this as one of them. So, Callie, I do see your hand. Let's go to Ryan, and then we'll go to you. So, Ryan, please go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Juan. This is Ryan Krinsky from the Department of Market Monitoring at the CAISO. So George, this design is definitely much more complete and getting much better than that than the ideas put out at that 2022 issue paper. So we definitely appreciate that. Couple of questions, because I think, you know, as we work through this, the devil is definitely going to be in the details in terms of how effective the design is at continuing to mitigate potential market power. So I definitely have a bunch of questions related to the RSI, which we'll hold those till the next slide. But for this one, I think a question that's not clear to me on this yet is, when is the competitive LMP set? Because, you know, as kind of we'll talk through, right? It's if the competitive, like someone's bids, even if they're deemed in a non-competitive area, a resource's bids are only mitigated if their bids are above the higher of that resource's default energy bid or their competitive LMP. So like in this one, because I'm looking at what slide are we on? Yeah, so I guess looking at this example one you have up. So BA 3 to 4 pass, no mitigation. So then, you know, what it is, but yet in this algorithm, you're not setting the competitive LMP at 25. And so that's just kind of my question is, I think in the last one, yeah, and that's a key detail. So, you know, let's say BA1 passed, right, at the price of with its MEC at 30. You know, if you set the competitive LMP for everyone then at 30, then there would be no more mitigation, right, for anyone else. So it's definitely kind of a key. Just trying to see if you clarify how you.
Right. So you're right, Ryan, and that's why in this methodology, when we find that the BA needs to be mitigated because its expanded group fails the RSI, we wait. We don't know what the competitive LMP is yet. We're not going to proclaim that the competitive LMP is $30 just because BA1 passes. We have to go further down after testing other groups to find out the group that the last BAA that we added it makes the group competitive, and that group will set the competitive LMP for all mitigations upwards. So in this case, when we add BAA 5 to the group of BAAs, and then we have an expanded group of 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5, and that expanded group becomes competitive. And now we say that BAA 5 has the lowest MEC in that expanded group, $15 in this example. So we'll use $15 as the competitive LMP for any mitigation that we'll do to any BAA in that expanded group, as we determined in previous steps. So in previous steps, we found out 1 and 2 that need to be mitigated, right? 3 and 4 were competitive. We didn't mitigate 3 and 4. So now we go back to 1 and 2, and we say we're going to use the $15 competitive LMP to mitigate the bids in 1 and 2. And in the next example, where we have to go deeper, because even when we add BA5, the group 1 through 5 still fails. That says that now we need to mitigate 1, 2, and 5, but we still don't know what the competitive LMP is. We go to the next step where we add 7 and 9, and now the entire group from 1 through 5 plus 7 plus 9 becomes competitive. So now we say, okay, what do we add? We added the group 7 and 9. The MEC is the lowest it's $12. So now we're going to go back to 1, 2, and 5 that we need to mitigate using the $12 as the competitive LMP. So there are, as you said, the devil is in the details, but the idea, the principle here is that when you add the BAA and you make a higher price group competitive, that BAA's MEC is the competitive LMP that you will use in your mitigation of any BAAs in that highest price group that you determined in previous steps. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think I get it now. That's great. Yeah, so in a way, you're kind of working from the lowest price up to get the competitive LMP. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, yeah, I think I get it. Yeah, try to write that out in a way that's it's an algorithm that can be done systematically. And I guess yeah, and then the other thing is also, I'm guessing you thought through this, but yeah, this is my first time seeing this. Maybe similar to JK's question, just if you're going to be able to write an algorithm that will systematically go through the groups like this. But yeah, that seems like
yeah.
I
don't worry about it. This looks like an interesting, a quiz for computer science people. I'm pretty sure we'll get this done.
Okay, yeah, this is a great step forward though from that August, the 2022 issue paper. So, thanks. I'll have more questions when we get, or maybe I could tee it up now. Or I'll wait to get to the next slide. A lot of questions about the RSI. That'll
sure.
do. Thanks.
Well, I think before we go into example 2, I want to go to Callie. So Callie, go ahead and let's unmute her and please go with your question.
Yeah, hi, this is Callie Wells with WPTF. So I have a couple, I think, higher level comments, but that conversation with George and Ryan, I know it's hard to refrain from talking about solutions when we're in the working group process, but I think both George and Ryan said the devil's are in the details. So I just wanted to make sure I understood something that was just said, or a couple things. So first, George, prior to that, I think what I heard you say is a BAA, so let's take that example with the BAA with a $30 price. If that BAA is tested and it's determined to be competitive, and it passes that test, but then if another BAA is added to that BA1, and now when they're tested together as a group, it fails, that BA1 is now subject to mitigation, even though on its own it was competitive. Did I understand that right, or did I miss something?
Yeah, no. If at some point in the step that you're testing the group, you're actually determining the competitiveness of that last group BAA that you added. The mitigation of previous groups have been determined in previous steps. So if in a previous step your group has passed, you do not mitigate bids in that group, even if later steps bring you groups that are expanded groups that are uncompetitive. So in our example, the group of 3 and 4, they were competitive. So in example 2, when we bring everything together, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, by adding BAA 5, still that entire group is not competitive, which says that BAA 5 needs to be mitigated. All right. We have already determined that 1 and 2 need to be mitigated, but we're not going to go back to 3 and 4 and say, we're going to mitigate 3 and 4 because along with the others, 1, 2, and 5, they are in a non-competitive group because they're competitive on their own. So that actually can help making the greater group of 1 through 5 competitive. All right. And if they can't, then that means BA5 needs to be mitigated anyway, but that doesn't mean that 3 and 4 need to be mitigated.
Okay, thank you. So I misunderstood,
right.
And I appreciate that clarification because I thought that that's what you said and that didn't sit right. So I appreciate that. So my misunderstanding on that one.
Yeah.
On the other one, when you and Ryan were talking about which competitive LMP would ultimately be used, it sounded like a BA might be tested, fails the RSI, so it's subject to mitigation, and the competitive LMP is 30. But then as you go through these steps, if it's in another group that also fails the test and that competitive LMP is lower than the lower competitive LMP is used for all the BAs in that group. Did I understand that one right?
The way I articulated to Ryan was that once you find a BAA or a BA group that you added and is competitive, then the MEC for that BAA is used as the competitive LMP for mitigating bids in any higher priced BAAs that you previously determined that need to be mitigated. So in this example here, right, BAA1 was found to be non-competitive. So we'll get back to it to mitigate bids once we find a competitive LMP for it. BA2, when we grouped with BA1, also was not competitive. So we're looking for a competitive LMP for mitigation of BA1 and BA2. We bring BA5 now, along with 3 and 4. The entire group is also non-competitive. All right, so we have to mitigate BA5 too. And then when we bring BAA 7 and 9 to the group, now we have a competitive expanded group. So now we say, we added 7 and 9, the lower price in that group, it's $12. So now we're going to use $12 as the competitive LMP going back to mitigate the bids for 1, 2, and 5. So basically, once you find a BAA that is competitive in this process, in the step, that BAA or BAA group, in this case 7 and 9, they set the competitive LMP for the mitigation that you're going to go back and do to the BAAs in the higher price BAAs in that group that you determined in previous steps that they need to be mitigated.
Okay, I appreciate that. Yes, that's one of the details that I think would be useful to think through once we get to the policy process. All right, so James, sorry, I had a couple, I guess, higher level questions because we are, we're in the working group process. So I think one of the rhetorical questions you threw out there was, obviously an approach like this makes the assumption that the CAISO BA is no longer competitive. One thing that we've been asking for, and maybe this is back to DMM's analysis, is if they have the ability to conduct some study to even see if that assumption is accurate. I think we've been asking for that data for a while, is whether or not the CAISO BA is actually structurally uncompetitive to where it makes sense to now make an assumption like this. And ideally that study would be forward looking and look at what the supply stack will look like, when this eventually gets implemented. And the other thing is, on this grouping approach, it does seem to address one of the problem statements that compared to the status quo today, it is addressing this issue of potential over mitigation, and obviously that's never a good thing to have in a market. But the analysis earlier also seemed to indicate that one of the issues with the current approach is that mitigation is triggered in these odd hours and shoulder months. So as we think through potential solutions in the policy process, I think it would be good to make sure that issue is also being addressed in one way or another in whatever design is ultimately, comes out through the policy process. So I did want to throw that in there just to kind of keep in the back of our minds as we talk through, potential changes that we can look at. Is that data analysis seemed to indicate another issue that I don't think we've articulated in a problem statement yet. So we might want to consider adding that. So that was all I had. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Callie. And James, I know that was to you. I just want to add, we have those two problem statements, but we are still completely open to additional ones, Callie. So I think, that's one of the benefits of analysis. So happy to hear a proposed problem statement as we kind of allow that to marinate and maybe formulate one here. But James, why don't we go ahead and let you kind of respond and chat.
Yeah, and I have one response to Callie's comment, and then also actually a follow-on question to Callie's original question about the competitive LMP, if I could, because I thought her question was interesting. So Callie used the word, the assumption would be that CAISO is no longer competitive. And I don't think that's exactly what we're saying. So today, the assumption is the CAISO is always competitive, meaning it's never tested. And looking at, the DMM puts out structural competitive metrics for the CAISO, which earlier in the presentation, they mentioned a few times that for non-CAISO EIM areas that they almost always fail. And I think you would expect the opposite for CAISO to be tested under the same type of RSI-3 test, where according to DMM's data, there are some hours of the year where the CAISO would fail an RSI-3 structural competitiveness test, but it's not, it would be considered competitive in all instances where it's tested and passes. So it's not quite an always or never, it's just that the CAISO would be tested just like everybody else, and the assumption would be almost all of the time the CAISO would pass. So I just wanted to elaborate on that. But then on the question, George, let me, the way I understood Callie's question, actually, could we go to slide 8, which the example I think will help me better articulate my question.
Go ahead.
So in this example, George, BA5 is competitive, and therefore the group BA1 and BA2, who have previously been determined to be non-competitive, used a competitive LMP of $15. But we've floated the idea of continuing the algorithm past this point, and floated the idea that it's possible that BA9 and 7 are uncompetitive when added to the group. And that means that if you were to continue the algorithm and find that BA9 and 7 in this case are uncompetitive, and then BA6 and 8 are competitive, would you have sort of disjointed different competitive LMPs for different BAs? Because you can imagine that now for BAs 9 and 7 who are uncompetitive, maybe the appropriate competitive LMP is $10, which is 6 and 8 marginal price. But that $10 price probably isn't a fair competitive LMP for BAs 2 and 1 who are also uncompetitive. Does that question make sense?
Yes, and this is what the proposal is, the way I articulated to Ryan. That's basically when you find BA5 being competitive, its MEC is the competitive LMP for any mitigation you do to higher price BAAs. Then when you add 7 and 9 and you find that the entire group now, the expanded group that includes 7 and 9 is non-competitive, now you mark 7 and 9 for mitigation. You cannot use the $15 competitive LMP because the entire group is not competitive. So you have to go further below. So when you add 6 and 8 and you find that now the entire market footprint is competitive because you add 6 and 8, the competitive LMP of $10 is going to be used for the mitigation of 7 and 9, but you're going to be using $15 to mitigate 1 and 2 in this proposal, because 1, 2, and 5 are in the same group, and that group has a competitive LMP of $15. That group is competitive. When you add 7 and 9, you have a non-competitive group, so now you got to look outside a lower price group that makes the entire group competitive, and that's 6 and 8 at $10. So you said the competitive LMP for mitigating 7 and 9, which they are in a non-competitive group, is going to be $10. But the competitive LMP for mitigating 1 and 2 is $15 because the A5 in that group makes it competitive at $15. So there is a staggered, if I can call it this way, determination of the competitive LMP that you will be using in this mitigation. So this is among the details that we talked earlier. Does that make sense?
Thank you. It does. Yes, thank you.
Ryan, I saw your hand pop up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just jump in this conversation just to continue to try to clarify this point more. Okay, so again, this example, you have BA1 failing, non-competitive. So 3 and 4 are deemed competitive. So and so how are you doing the design so that the $25 doesn't set the competitive LMP for BA1? Is because you're saying that they're not part of the same group, and so your algorithm is going to differentiate them?
Correct. They're not in the same group. They come into the same group when BA5 joins that group. So now you have the group of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And if that group is competitive, then the lowest MEC in that group, which is $15, is the competitive LMP that you'll use for any mitigation of 1 and 2. When you find that 3 and 4 is competitive, you won't use the $25 as the competitive LMP because 3 and 4 are not at that step in the same group with 1 and 2. So you have to wait until you bring in BA5 into the picture to determine the competitive LMP for 1 and 2. Make sense?
Yeah, no. From this example, it makes sense. But it's going to be. I think it's going to be tricky to come up with an algorithm to define the groups this way. But no, in theory, like I like it.
It's a good computer science quiz.
Yeah. Okay.
Find the algorithm.
Thanks.
It's a take-home exam. Anyone can try it. Do we have any more questions?
Any others? Yeah, no, great example and great discussion. Any other questions on example 1 here?
Or example 2.
You're good to go. Or 2, yep.
All right. Yeah. So I'm going to go to the last slide where we are going to talk about some more details in general on the proposal and some questions. Some of the items were contemplated in previous stakeholder engagements when we're talking about system market power mitigation for the ISO and stuff. So they become relevant now, and we need to ask these questions. We need to get some direction, have a Q&A discussion. So as we said in this proposal, we don't treat the ISO BAA as any special BAA. It has the same treatment like any other BAA. At least that's what the proposal is. However, there are some special features that are that manifest for the ISO BAA, and one of them is intertie bids. The ISO Balancing Authority area has intertie bids from either non-EIM BAAs in the WEM or non-EDAM BAAs in EDAM. And although these intertie bids are not subject to mitigation because we assume that there are competitive conditions at the interties when these bids compete, they could be considered in the supply counterflow calculations to determine if a supplier is pivotal. What does that mean? In the RSI-3 test, all right, when we determine the pivotal suppliers, we determine how much a supplier has the potential to withhold supply counterflow to a binding transmission congestion. And we're looking at the bids, and basically you have, if you take all the bids from that supplier, you have the maximum supply counterflow. If you take the lower economic limit on those bids, you have the minimum supply counterflow. And the range between maximum and minimum supply counterflow determines what we call potential withheld capacity. And we rank the suppliers or supplier affiliates based on that metric to determine the 3 pivotal suppliers, which are the ones that they have the highest potential withheld supply counterflow from this binding constraint. Well, this calculation could include intertie bids that are under the control of this SC affiliate. And therefore, it could influence or affect whether a supplier is among the 3 pivotal suppliers or not. So the question we're raising here is, should we include the intertie bids in this evaluation of the supply counterflow for determining the 3 pivotal suppliers, the 3 largest pivotal suppliers? even though the intertie bits are not mitigated, they may affect the determination of who is a pivotal supplier. Now, if we go down that route, this is going to be quite complicated because obviously we have to take into consideration that not all intertie supply under the control of an affiliate, of an SC affiliate, is available to the market. There are constraints on interties, the scheduling limits. We call them ISLs, ITCs. So the scheduling limits can constrain all the supply from a specific intertie, and it may be constraining the supply of a specific affiliate. So we need to take that into consideration. And that by itself is not a small task because specifically for the ISO, we have nested scheduling limits among different groups of interties. So the determination subject to these constraints, it's going to be quite complicated. So this question here has two sides. The policy aspect of whether it makes sense to include intertie bits in the determination of who is of whether an SC affiliate is pivotal, and then an implementation question that comes afterwards. Okay, if we go to decide to do that, then we have a lot of complexity that comes into the picture because of the nested scheduling limits on intertie. So that's one question we want to have some discussion and some direction going forward. Let me state all the questions here and then we open for discussion. Another aspect that ISO may be uniquely situated, at least at the time being, with respect to other BAs, is that we have virtual bids in the day-ahead market for the ISO. And we treat virtual bids in almost all aspects exactly the same as physical bids. So, for congestion, virtual bids and regular bids from, I shouldn't say regular, bids from physical resources are counted exactly the same for congestion management. There's no difference. So when it comes to mitigation, market power mitigation, we should consider virtual bids in the supply counterflow, even though they're not mitigated. So it's kind of similar with the previous point. Intertie bids are not mitigated. The question is, should we consider intertie bids in the supply counterflow calculations? Here, virtual bids are also not mitigated, but here we have to consider virtual bids in the supply counterflow calculation because they're just like any physical bid. They have the same impact on congestion. And there are no constraints like scheduling limits that will limit them. It's just your regular transmission constraints that are binding. So that's one clarification. We want to get some feedback that there's agreement to use the virtual bids in the supply counterflow, although they're not mitigated. The next two questions are about features that they were contemplated in the previous initiative that we had for system market power mitigation. One of them, and there were discussions on this back then also with the Market Surveillance Committee, so we had some direction from them. So one of them is that when you do the calculation of the supply counterflow to determine if a supplier is pivotal, the suggestion is to perhaps only include in this calculation supply that is in excess of scheduled load for SC affiliates, in the rationale being that an SC affiliate may be large in the sense that they have a lot of supply, but they may also be having a lot of demand. So in the determination of whether they're pivotal or not, should we offset their supply by their demand and only consider or evaluate whether they're pivotal for the amount of the supply counterflow that they have in the market in excess of what they need for meeting their own demand? If you go that route, you may find some large SC affiliates are not pivotal, right? Because maybe they have enough supply to meet their demand in the market. So that will not make them pivotal. If you exclude the demand from this determination, you may find that there is a lot of supply, so they have a potential withheld capacity that puts them in the top three. Is this an accurate or a justified determination, considering that they have to meet their own demand anyway? Are they considered pivotal if we take all their supply? So that's the question for this one. And then a related one, if we determine in this process that we need to mitigate bids in a BAA, this question asks whether we should only mitigate bids from pivotal suppliers. And the rationale is that if a supplier is not pivotal, what does it mean pivotal? A supplier is pivotal if we must take at least one bid from that supplier to mitigate a binding constraint, to do congestion management on a binding uncompetitive constraint. Actually, yeah, now we know if they're competitive or not. So if it's an uncompetitive constraint, and we have to take a bid from a supplier to mitigate congestion on that constraint, then that supplier is pivotal. And the concept is that if it is an uncompetitive constraint, then that pivotal supplier can exercise market power because we have to use at least one of its bids to mitigate the congestion. However, if the supplier is not pivotal, okay, that means we don't have to take a bid or any bid from that supplier, all right, because it's not pivotal to mitigate the congestion. So even though we have an uncompetitive congestion, should we mitigate the bids from that supplier if it's not pivotal? So the question here is maybe we only need to mitigate bids from pivotal suppliers. And that doesn't mean only the 3 largest pivotal suppliers that we use in the RSI 3 test. There may be other suppliers that are pivotal that are not among the top 3. So if we go down this route, then we need to determine all the pivotal suppliers. And the method to do that is we take the 3 highest pivotal suppliers that we use in the RSI 3 test, and then we start replacing in merit order of their potential withheld capacity, the 3rd supplier with the 4th, the 5th, etc., finding out all the suppliers that are pivotal while the RSI, the resource supply index, is still below 1. Then we can find all the pivotal suppliers. The moment we add a supplier to the 3rd position that makes the RSI 1 or higher, now the supplier is not pivotal anymore, and then we can stop mitigating there. So I'll open here for questions or discussion on these topics. These are the elements of the final elements of the market power mitigation proposal we're going forward. And let's start with Ryan. He has some questions.
Yep. Thanks, George. Let's see. So I think a key question for, which looks like it's not up here in this slide, but I think a key question for the design going forward is what do we do with the demand for counterflow in this RSI, so the denominator of the RSI. So can you go back to your slide 4? I think there's I just have a question about what's done today.
Let me.
I think it's slide 30 of the combined deck. For people following at home.
Let me do it manually because otherwise it may take more. And I need the cooperation of my screen here. So slide 4, right? This one maybe?
Yes, yeah. So the second sub bullet, and then, well, sorry, the first sub bullet, then the second bullet of that, the demand for counterflow DCF is the scheduled load or the demand forecast. So and this is saying how NPM's done today. So for flow-based constraints, the demand for counterflow is coming. It's only coming from it's calculated from the resources that are downstream of binding constraint that are actually dispatched up. It's a dispatch in the NPM run. So,
yeah, it's the sum of all the contributions, flow contributions to constraint from resources that they have a counterflow contribution.
Yeah. So is this sub-bullet just is this kind of shorthand that it's for the BA level mitigation currently? Is this just kind of shorthand saying yes, it's basically the scheduled load, or are you saying that you all have actually implemented the BA level mitigation differently from the flow-based, so that you are actually in the demand for counterflow, it is higher demand?
Yeah. So it's interesting. It's one and the same. What I'm trying to say here is that it's really your same DCPA approach applied to the power balance constraint instead of a transmission constraint. And when you apply to the power balance constraint, your supply counterflow includes all the supply. It's like every resource has a shift factor of -1. So it fully contributes to meeting the demand in the power balance constraint. So when you do the calculation of the supply counterflow, you'll get the entire supply from any resource, any supply resource in the BAA. And then the demand for counterflow, which is your flow on the constraint, well, for the power balance constraint, is either the scheduled load, if we are in IFM, or the demand forecast, if you are in RAC or RTM. So it turns out to be that.
Well, but if you're then this is kind of what I'm getting at, the kind of a potential key point is that if the demand for counterflow is actually the generation inside of the BA that's dispatched up in the NPM run, then that can be different than the load. That'll be different than the load forecast if there's transfers coming into the area. And so I think there's kind of it's kind of an important point, because this is kind of the original NPM design, and when we did the DCPA calculation, by having the denominator of this RSI be the generation that's dispatched up in the NPM run, right downstream of the constraint, the implicit assumption there, the assumption there is that the flow coming in, the transfers in over that constraint are competitive.
So that's a good observation. So your transfer has a value. So this is ADAM and EIM. Your transfer has a value, a scheduled value at the NPM solution, right? And for the RSI that you perform for the BA or the BA group in the enhanced proposal, any transfers with that BA or that BA group, we consider them fixed, right? So it doesn't matter. It's like including them in the supply counterflow on top if they're imports, right? And then including them in the demand for counterflow because they offset the demand, or you just ignore them. All right, the ratio is supply counterflow divided by the demand counterflow. So if you consider that the transfers are fixed, they're not a factor in the determination of the competitiveness of the BAA, other than what we discussed here in the grouping approach, where you have the import constraint groups and et cetera. But if you don't consider them as a variable, when you do the evaluation, you're just taking the NPM solution. You say, okay, this is my solution. I consider the transfers are fixed now. What changes is really the supply counterflow from bids in the BAA. And the demand for counterflow is your demand. So essentially, you say we have a certain demand. Let's say we're in EIM. So we have a demand forecast to meet. All right, this is offset by some transfer, some net transfer. That's fine. That's your net demand, let's call it. And then how is the supply counterflow, all the supply schedules in that BAA, how competitive are in meeting that net demand forecast? Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I guess maybe this is worth an example. I could talk through it quickly, because I've been thinking about this quite a bit. But I think I'm just saying it does matter. It definitely matters when in terms of talking about what do you do with the net supply relative to a certain SC's load. I think it definitely matters in terms of the design here, if the demand for counterflow is the load in the area, or if it's what I think it is currently, how it's implemented is the generation that's actually inked up in the area in the NPM run. Because in that scenario, right, if there's transfers coming in, say there's a lot of transfers coming in, then there'd be in a certain BA, there might be very little generation inked up, right, in that BA. And so the demand for counterflow, if you calculate it as a generation inked up in the NPM run, would actually be really low, right? And implicit there is that the assumption that flow coming in over the transfers is competitive. And in a grouping design, that may not be an appropriate assumption, right?
Well, not that whenever we're doing an evaluation either for a BAA or for a group, that's import constraint, right? That's because it's a higher price than other BAAs in the rest of the footprint, right? So they're import constraint, which means that they're having some imports. So their net demand is less than their actual demand because they're having some imports. So the evaluation is really asking the question, is the available supply in that group sufficient to meet competitively the net demand in that group? So basically you offset the demand by whatever imports are coming in your solution, and that's import constrained. So there's a fixed value there, right? So you say, okay, some part of the demand is met by imports, but is the rest of the demand, can the rest of the demand be met competitive by the available supply in the group? That's your RSI 3 question, right?
Right. But the issue though is let's say every area is really non-competitive. It's kind of one supplier. Say BA1 shipping power to BA2. BA1 is not competitive. BA2 under the current design would be non-competitive. So there's just one supplier there, and they have some third-party load. If most of BA2's power is demand is actually met by transfers in from the non-competitive BA1, right? Then the amount of generation actually inked up in BA2 would be pretty low. And if you limit the supply in the numerator to just and you allow the supply in the numerator to be equal to that company's the supply from that company that has the load, then that BA2 is always going to pass the RSI. It's always going to have an RSI greater than 1, even though it may have some third party load. So this is probably something that's worth it. Maybe this is LMPM 301, and we can put together some slides on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ryan, if you can you send me an email with an example of what you mean, and then we can walk through it. Because I'm not fully, maybe I'm not getting all the aspects of what you're trying to explain. So if you can just shoot me an email with the details, and then I'll see what you mean.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
George, if we could go back to your slide with the questions, because I think there's a lot of you had 3 pretty crucial kind of considerations here. Callie, I see your hand is up. Let's go ahead and unmute Callie, please.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF again. So that conversation was really interesting, and it kind of touched a little bit on something I've been struggling with or trying to think through when we're talking about the existing mitigation approach. And I just kind of want to, again, put on the table, maybe not for a complete discussion today, but something that I think would be worth talking through as we think about these problem statements with the existing approach. And it always has kind of struck me a little odd, for lack of a better term, that we are triggering the testing. So we run the RSI test based on import constraint. And I know it's applied to the PBC, but really you get that power balance constraint separation when an area is import constrained. So the triggering is based on essentially congestion into that area. But yet the RSI test, when George was kind of talking through what the demand and the supply, wasn't really the same. It's looking more at the BAA level. So I do wonder if maybe some of the issues we are seeing are kind of manifested because of this this mismatched approach between triggering the test on congestion into the area, but then doing a calculation based on RSI, but for structural uncompetitiveness, whether or not that is appropriate. So I just wanted to throw that out there. It's been something that's just kind of in the back of my mind, and that conversation with George and Ryan highlighted it again for me. So it would be useful, I think, to have some sort of discussion around this sooner rather than later when we start to really finalize the problem statements and trying to understand what's causing the issues.
Kelly, I'm not sure what issues you're referring to, and maybe I'm not getting the full gist here, but the discussion that I had with Ryan was basically trying to explain how we intend to deal with the transfers that are at the solution, at the NPM solution, which essentially they modify the demand for counterflow, etc. So what I explained to Ryan, and we'll have an offline discussion on that to make sure that this explanation is understood, and we'll look at all the aspects of it. So what I said was that when you perform the RSI, you have elements in the numerator and the denominator, right? And you find the ratio. And the denominator is the demand for counterflow. In this case, your demand in the BAA group. Now you're doing it at the group. So you have the demand for your BAA group at the bottom, all right? And at the denominator, and you have the supply counterflow in the numerator, and you get the maximum supply counterflow from fringe competitive suppliers and the minimum supply counterflow from the three pivotal suppliers, and that's your numerator. Now, the transfers, we consider them fringe competitive suppliers. So there are two approaches, and they yield the same result. You either consider the transfers, so therefore you put them in the supply counterflow in the numerator as a fixed quantity as part of your fringe competitive supply, right? Or you just take them out from the denominator and you don't put them in the numerator. Say, okay, you have a net demand, which is your demand minus your net import transfer. And then you just try to find what's the RSI for meeting your net demand from your supply resources, excluding the transfer. The result is going to be the same. You will find definitively whether the group is competitive or not, either way you go. It's just a detail on how you perform the calculation, but the result is the same, right?
Yeah, I wasn't referring to that, George, and I appreciate you walking through that again. I understand that it's really supply over demand. When you use the term counterflow, I automatically go to transmission congestion and the counterflow across that transmission line in the opposite direction. But that kind of gets to the point I was trying to make, is it's maybe a higher level point, is that the mechanism you're using to trigger whether or not to even run the RSI in the first place is really based on congestion into that area, right? Because it's congestion, it's transfer constraint into an area that causes the PBC to separate. But then when you run the RSI, that calculation you just walked through, which I completely understand, is supply in that BA over demand in that BA, right? So it's
for the group.
Well, we're not talking proposals yet. We're still in the working group phase. So one of the issues is that same ratio, right? So it's really this almost mismatch of you're almost using more of a transmission-based trigger to then run the RSI calculation for a BA level mitigation. And it's more of that higher level question that I was just kind of throwing out there. Your conversation with Ryan reminded me of that issue that I've kind of been struggling with, and just wanted to throw that out there as something to talk about. Because I do wonder if maybe that's part of the reason we're seeing mitigation in these odd hours, is because you would expect transfer constraint when, for example, the CAISO has significant amount of solar and wind, and it's exporting it to other BAAs in the midday hours, and maybe that BAA hasn't submitted enough bids to pass the RSE, but it's not all of its supply because it's in the midday hours. So just again, I wasn't questioning or talking about what you and Ryan just talked through. It was kind of another higher level question that I've been struggling with the current design that I think would be worthwhile at some point.
Thank you.
Okay. No, thank you, Callie. I see you're off. Callie, go ahead. Do you have a... Sorry, I'm seeing your mute toggle on and off here. Can we unmute Callie just to...
Yeah, nope, sorry, I didn't mean to.
There we go.
I think that was a toggling issue, was not meant to be unmuted again. Thank you, though.
Oh, okay. Very good. Thank you, Callie. And so, Callie, maybe we can follow up on that point on your question offline here and kind of get a better sense. And I think we've had, there were a couple of questions to George here that I think that once they get answered, and maybe they need a little bit deeper conversation, we can commit to bringing that back, those lessons learned from those conversations back to the working group. Want to make sure that that everybody kind of benefits from that discussion, even if it's just kind of planting the seed for a subsequent discussion here. So George, I believe that is your final slide. Is that correct? Okay.
Indeed.
So are there any? Well, thank you very much for making the time and spending the time with us here. I know that our stakeholders have requested this very specifically, right? Just a deeper dive into the grouping concept itself. Before we move on, are there any other questions? Maybe not necessarily with these three questions that George kind of brought up, but while we have his time here, any other questions on the grouping methodology as a potential enhancement, which we'll be exploring a little bit further? Kind of a last call. Please go ahead and raise your hand if so. All right, George, I'm seeing none. Thank you very much. And event producer, if we could go ahead and put up the next slide. Thank you so much. All right, so let's go ahead. Everybody, let's take a moment, kind of stand up, stretch. This is where we're getting into the interactive portion here, because this is really to be a stakeholder-led discussion. So hopefully everybody had a chance to take a look at the slides that we have put up here. Again, my apologies for the need to have kind of an updated slide deck go in. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, and we'll give this one a moment for everybody to read here. But we've spent quite a bit of time, I think, in the discussion with George, addressing some of the adjacent points to this. But here's the CAISO problem statement number 5 from the last session that we had. We didn't get a chance to dive into the problem statements, but we're reviewing just overall scarcity pricing. So the dynamic competitive path assessment test BAAs in isolation and does not consider external available supply. Now we've seen, again, I think Callie's brought this up, the design of any kind of an enhancement is for later, but let's take into account the things that we need to consider, the points that we need to have better understanding for, and again, really kind of focus in on the impacts that we're looking for. So the market impact here is that if we were to consider those other resources or externally available supply, it should result in a reduction in BAA level DCPA test failures. I think we've seen a couple examples of that, but this is the first problem statement that we're wanting to kind of dig into. I think we've had a lot of information presented to us as far as different ways to effectuate it. So I'd really like to see whether CAISO staff, stakeholders, just the initial reactions. Is there anything that you would like to kind of explore a little bit further? Is there anything that perhaps we could provide? Ryan, I see your hand has gone up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, unfortunately, this does get into the details of what George and I just talked about, right? So I think for the next set of comments, I can write this issue up. But what I think my claim is that the DCPA, it currently does consider external available supply because of what I believe to be how the demand for counterflow is implemented. That the demand for counterflow is actually reduced by transfers into the BAA. And so I can try to talk to an example now, or we could I can note that and write up an example in our next set of comments to kind of go into why I think that the current market power mitigation it does actually consider transfers in as competitive supply. So I'd say the issue is more when you go to the grouping, it allows groups to be considered together, and it's to be which doesn't do now. It just considers one BA at a time. So let me know if you want to discuss that.
I'm hearing kind of a bifurcation. Oh, I'm sorry, Ryan. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, So yeah, so I guess I'm saying that given the current implementation, kind of the details of how the RSI is calculated, I would say that, you know, that the DCPA, it does actually consider external available supply. It considers the transfers, I think, as competitive supply currently, I think. But that's, again, that's the discussion that George and I just had, which it gets deep in the details, which I can write up more, but just wanted to note that here.
I appreciate that, Ryan, and we look forward to those comments. Again, we're going to be providing a good amount of time here, but what I'm hearing from you is kind of bifurcating this problem statement, right? That in essence the BAs and tested in isolation, you know, changing that could result in a reduction of test failures, but the detail of considering external available supply. Look forward to hearing from you and your comments. Really appreciate you guys as a stakeholder in this process. JK, I saw your hand go up. I'm not sure if that's a reaction to Ryan or a reaction here, but let's go ahead and unmute JK, please.
Thank you, Juan. My comments is reaction to both Ryan and his statement. I think Ryan raised a very good point, but at the same time, I feel the statement, the use of DCPA itself may cause certain confusions because, you know, it's very clearly laid out what DCPA means. We have the technical appendix for the, you know, for the local market power mitigation. And apparently that approach has a few difference between what is named the DCPA here for BAA market power mitigation, and because the BAA market power mitigation itself does not really have a competitive path. It's really based on, you know, what Kelly and Ryan discussed with George before, you know, using the demand and supply in that BAA. So I wonder if the use of DCPA terminology here is truly proper, and can we distinguish that name, you know, somehow, maybe, you know, give it, I understand it's used together with BA, but it caused a lot of confusion, like internally PG&E, like in the beginning of the discussion.
Yeah, no, JK, I appreciate that, and I think a lot of the terminology here, you know, we could stand to make sure that we're clarifying it. I mean, we had a long conversation just on what was meant by BAA level MPM. George, I see your hand up. Please go ahead and weigh in.
Oh, yes, certainly. Oh, yeah, I just wanted to clarify this. We're not using the same term DCPA here just for the sake of drawing a parallel with what we're doing for LMPM. It actually mathematically, you can see that it's the same methodology. When you test for the competitiveness of the power balance constraint, essentially you are still testing it in the same manner as if you're testing for the competitiveness of a binding transmission constraint. If you use -1 as a shift factor for your supply, because all supply contributes with a shift factor of -1 to the power balance constraint, then your supply counterflow is really your entire supply in that BAA. And your demand for counterflow is what is the flow on the power balance constraint. If you put the demand on the other side, that's your demand. So if you play this out, you'll see that's exactly the same approach. You have exactly the same formula, and it so happens that your supply counterflow is really your supply, and your demand for counterflow is really your demand. And if you want to take into consideration the net transfer, that was the discussion we had with Ryan, you can either consider it as part of fringe competitive supply on the left-hand side of that inequality constraint, or you can take it on the other side, you subtract it from the demand, and then you have net demand on the right-hand side. It doesn't matter. At the end, you're really finding out if your supply counterflow, maximum fringe competitive supply minus plus minimum pivotal supply is greater than or equal to your net demand minus net transfer import. So it just turns out to be exactly the same method. So that's why we're comfortable to use the same DCPA. We're not suggesting that it's a different methodology. It's really the same thing. Mathematically, it turns out to be the same method. So that's why I was trying to not deviate and say we're doing something different. It's really the same approach. Thank you.
JK, yeah, let's go ahead and unmute JK again. And, you know, this is where we're looking for this kind of conversation. So just PSA to all, you know, don't put that hand down. We're wanting this back and forth. So JK, go ahead.
Well, thank you so much, and I appreciate George just walk us through, you know, why the CAISO apply this name here, and I fully understand that. But I feel like, you know, you know, mathematically they are very the same. But I wonder, you know, I guess historically when you name the name DCPA, because that apply to the transmission constraint, right? The transmission constraint is a path. And I understand the CAISO is trying to draw analogy and make linkage between the two, but here really we're not testing. It's a different constraint that we're applying this method to. I fully appreciate the mathematic similarity, but I hope the name itself can be more intuitive, and probably it's just not generic enough. You know, it's somehow like just confused in terms of, you know, we're looking at a competitive path, but itself, I feel like, you know, it's not that intuitive when you say, oh, there's a counterflow of demand or counterflow of supply within that BAA. I guess, yeah, I fully understand what George tries to explain, but still, you know, the name itself, I hope it can make at the same time a distinguish between the two, because they are tasked of different things. There's no task of, for example, you know, intertie flows into a BAA or anything like that.
So JK, you're probably right. Maybe we don't need the term DCPA. We can just call it an RSI-3 test. I know that the C competitive path, DCPA competitive path suggests, okay, this is a transmission congestion, power balance constraint. Maybe mathematically you can see it as a transmission congestion, but we don't see it as such. We call it power balance constraint. It probably means different than a transmission constraint to most people. So if the DCPA term is really the culprit here, maybe we can drop it. We say we do an RSI-3 test for the BAA group, and then just and then the way you do the RSI-3 test, it's exactly the same that what we do for a transmission constraint, but we don't have to use the same term if that's problematic. How's that?
Right. Yeah, I really appreciate it. I mean, like, you know, the accessibility to math is not really available to everyone. So at least it was challenging to me in the beginning. So I really appreciate the commendation, the CAISO.
Really appreciate you bringing that up, JK. I think having a common language as we approach these problems and the common understanding of it helps. So anything that we can do as far as, you know, increasing the clarity of what the intent is of the problem statement and, you know, its intended market impact, we're definitely open to that. So thank you very much. Any other reactions from the stakeholder community on in essence, you know, this RSI testing, going through the RSI test in BAs in isolation, changing that, you know, the resulting in reduction of BA level of those test failures. There's any other reactions or any other items to be considered or any other feedback? Okay. I think we get into the next, we could go to the next slide. I think we're going to get into the next topic, which definitely has a lot of interdependency here. So here's the problem statement that we have. And again, we are open to hearing, you know, refinements to these, whether they be assisting with understanding through the terminology, you know, Ryan's comment on perhaps bifurcating that into two individual problem statements, as well as newer problem statements for us to consider as a group here. So the CAISO BAA is always considered quote unquote competitive, and the DCPA does not apply to it. The market impact here is that, the intended market impact is it may lead to under mitigation in the CAISO and to WM areas during conditions where the CAISO BAA itself is itself not structurally competitive. So I know there's a little back and forth here, Callie and James earlier on this point, but just want to put this one out here for any reactions from the community here. Let's go ahead and open the line, so to speak. And that does also include the CAISO team. You guys are taking it easy on us today. I know that we covered quite a bit, and we had a lot of discussion on a lot of the details a little bit earlier. So let's give it another moment. Would really like to hear if this seems like a problem statement. Again, these problem statements are going to lead us to the potential solutioning. We also want to hear if there are items that you need more information on. Ryan, I see your hand. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just to break the silence, I thought I'd chime in since I've been talking today anyway. Yeah, no, I think this is a good problem statement. Yeah, DMM agrees this is something worth considering in this initiative. So thank you for making this a problem statement. That's it for me.
Appreciate that, Ryan. Callie, let's go ahead and unmute Callie.
Yeah, hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. I figured I'd just chime in since it seemed like it was quiet on the other ends. So I'm not disagreeing that this isn't the case, but I think as we articulate this as a problem statement and get into the policy process, one of the things that we're going to have to do when we evaluate different designs is put some magnitude around the problems. And so that's why we've been asking for the analysis is how big of an issue is this? And should the design be done in such a way to specifically and fully address that, right? Because that's part of the trade-off conversation that's going to eventually happen once we get to the policy process. So it would be nice before we get to that process to put some magnitude around this and all the other problem statements, not just this one. So I just wanted to provide a little bit more context as to why we've been asking for the analysis. And I know DMM does a great job in their annual reports doing that, doing a study, but a forward-looking study I think would be useful in this case.
Thank you, James. I saw your hand go up. Is that in response to Callie, or do you have a statement? Go ahead. Let's go ahead and unmute you, James.
I just wanted to clarify with Callie, when specifically when you say magnitude, are you thinking of like under the grouping approach, what would the impact on the frequency of mitigation and some of those other metrics that Nicole presented earlier, just so we know, what exactly you're looking for as a next step.
Yeah, so no, I appreciate that question because it'll hopefully help clarify the ask. So not on the grouping approach, right? Because that is presupposing the ultimate solution that will be adopted. This is more on, is the CAISO BA level, on a BA level scenario, how often is it competitive versus uncompetitive? So maybe more doing an analysis like the CAISO does in their annual report or DMM does in their annual report, but forward looking. So we can get an idea of, is this a huge issue if we assume it's competitive? Because some of the conversations earlier when we were talking about BA level design, I think it was maybe Ryan who brought it up or JK, the idea of, is there a point at which we stop doing that sequential stepping or maybe a trade-off with feasibility? And one of those options might be, once we get to the CAISO BA, include that in the group. If we assume it's always competitive, maybe that's a natural place to stop. So more, I hope that helps, but more in terms of not necessarily in the grouping proposal, but in an isolated study of the CAISO BA itself in like using expected supply, and I'm going to throw a date out there of 2026. I hope that helps, but happy to continue this conversation offline to get more into the details.
Yeah, Callie, I think, no, I appreciate that. And I think that perhaps we should, and again, any of the conversations that we have offline, we are going to be bringing them back to the working group, maybe in a condensed and distilled format. But I think understanding, what you mean by forward-looking and seeing what is feasible there would definitely be helpful. So we'll be reaching out to you. Appreciate you raising your hand and commenting here.
Yeah, of course. Thanks.
Okay. Any other reactions? Any other statements? Again, we've had some good conversation, kind of centered around these two, but not really getting into the problem statements themselves. We've heard needs. Callie articulated, some requests for needs. We've heard stakeholders articulate support of the problem statement. Right, this is the kind of discussion that we're wanting to have together here in the working groups. James, go ahead.
I just want to take a moment to maybe put a bow on things. Can you go to the last slide or the previous slide? Oh, yeah, this one. So one thing that kind of stands out to me in this slide that is yeah, I think that the market impact is clear, and I hope that for those listening on the phone, we did a fair job of demonstrating all else equal why you'd probably have fewer RSI-3 test failures relative to today's approach because of the grouping and the ability to be competitive as a group obviates the need for mitigation. And it's not, I want to be clear that on a principle level, it's not necessarily a reduction of mitigation that is the point. It's that it is a more accurate assessment of the ability to exercise market power. That's the point. And so that's kind of the principle of what we're trying to accomplish here. And then if you move that into slide 39, can we go to slide 39? Thank you. So it also dawns on me that the question about whether or not the grouping approach would lead to a reduction in test failures does somewhat depend on this question also. Because as we talked about today, the status quo is the CAISO is always competitive, and therefore any group or any BAA that has a power balance constraint shadow price less than the CAISO's is not tested. And we had discussed the open question of whether or not, as Callie brings up, whether or not it's appropriate to continue the algorithm past the CAISO. And it may be possible that, as we teased out, that you may, if the mitigation was extended beyond, the algorithm was extended beyond the CAISO, you may be testing and failing BAs that are not mitigated today. And that it runs counter to the previous slide that says it will result in a reduction. Now, my hunch is all else equal, it will be a reduction, but even in that case, where relative to the status quo, if you have BAs that fail the DCPA, that have lower PBC shadow prices than the CAISO, that still aligns with the principle, potentially, in my mind, of creating a more accurate assessment of the ability to exercise market power, even if the overall effect in that case is not a reduction in the test. And so I just wanted to sort of tie a bow on that and try to bring it up to a principle level and see if that generates any concluding thoughts from any stakeholders. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Callie, I'm not sure if that is a legacy hand raise there, but want to check in? Okay. Definitely a lot to chew on in today's conversation. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide, please. And I'm going to hand this over to Brenda to give our next steps. And oh, you know what? Let's hang on one second. Let's go back if we could. JK, let's go ahead and unmute JK. Please share your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Juan. I wasn't going to ask a question about a statement, but have a request. I think PG&E raised it in our survey. We were asking for the reference of detailed formulations of existing MPM, BA level MPM. I know there's a reference, but we appreciate if CAISO can link the formulation somewhere so we can, go into it for a better understanding of the practice.
Yes. No. Thank you, JK. We'll get back to the whole group on that. We need to check in and see if we have that available. So we will post that if we are able to. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much.
Of course. Okay. Last call. Any? Yeah. Doesn't, like JK said. Additional requests are also part of the conversation for these problem statements. The last call for hands here. Okay. Let me give it just a second, guys. All right. Well, I really appreciate everybody who participated today. Thank you to Nicole and Ryan. Thank you to George, and thank you to all of you for giving us a piece of your day and having this discussion. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide, and I'll hand this over to Brenda.
Thank you, Juan, and thank you to our panelist group here today and those great questions. As a reminder, we have posted the slide deck with also George's edits as well, so keep an eye out for that. Those will be posted within the next few minutes. And we also expedited that recording for this call. So we plan to post the recording as soon as possible when the event producer provides their technical team provides it for us. So we'll be able to share that out, see that recording as soon as possible. And thanks so much for everyone who's been able to participate. We do have plans of providing a common template for today's session. Our team, our PF team internally will be working on those questions and having those set up and reflect on today's discussion. So we target possibly next week having those questions on the common template finalized. The date that we might target for the ending of this common template for session 8 will be possibly December 15th. We do have on our calendar a date for the December 12th PFE working group. We will make sure to send out a notice for that once that is confirmed. But other than that, we do have these working group sessions here. And then our upcoming working group sessions at January 2024 will be around scarcity pricing. So we will make sure those notices confirm that exact topic as well. But we thank so much everyone for joining us. And then the next slide is a brief repetition of our blog. Oh, sorry, this is a reference slide where we have all the price formation enhancement documents and also the links I've sent through the chat during the beginning of time was all the links that James provided for our working group too. So that was also in the slide. Next slide. 2 more slides. Another slide again. So yeah, this is the energy blog that we post. We haven't posted one recently, but we do plan to post one soon about our energy blog and what's happening at the ISO grid. And we thank so much for everyone for joining us today, as well for being able to assist us today with this recording. And we could go ahead and send it off to Yolanda to go ahead and close our call.
Thank you for joining today's conference. The conference is now finished. You may now disconnect.